Well, everyone, here I am. Steve's here. Charlie's here. Hello, Charles.
Hello there.
I've got my hand upon Buddy's back here. He's here. Hello, Buds. He's around. He's sat down next to me on my left-hand side, and this is edition 1861. Oh, he just jumped on me knee. He's the only boy who does, aren't you? Yeah, 1861, and it's Saturday, November the 10th when you receive this, but we're recording on the Wednesday. Today I'm back on the suffragettes. I've been captured by a bunch of mischievous girls, otherwise known as the Pankhurst sisters, and their determined mum, Emmeline. Now, the first thing I want to say is, for any of my friends at Margaret's Partially Sighted Society, I apologise that you've heard some of this, because I talked about it last week. Me and Brendan sorted the Irish border out. Have you ever met Brendan? Have you ever met him?
I can't say I have.
Okay. Well, we sorted the Irish border out. That took about 5 minutes. And then Naomi and her dog Dixie took me through to my bus stop. Very kind of her. And the dog, of course. And I'm sorry if you've heard some of this, but it's not exactly the same talk that you heard last week. And to be honest, I enjoy this subject so much, I'm doing it again. Now, I don't like to come out with theories about history, really. I just want to know what happened. I've said this before. There are plenty of people who've got solutions, and they'll tell you that they know what happened and they know it's right, and that's it. Well, all I know is some things are a lot simpler than historians would have you believe. And there's just one word I want to use where this is concerned: families. If you put the news on any day, a lot of the stories are really to do with fallouts within family units and the result of them. And also, you should not, I'm sure you wouldn't, but you shouldn't assume that people who are in charge of us, people who are in positions of power, are any different than everybody else. And a lot of their actions are governed by personal dislike or fallout or events. So a lot of historic events have really been caused by the simple fact that two people did not get on. Not the kind of thing that historians normally mention. Well, they'll mention it, but they'll usually, if it's an important event, they'll usually want to attribute something of importance to bring it about. However, often these are family events, and that is, as you'll find, is what's attractive to me about this story. In regards to the suffragette movement, the mere fact today, 100 years later, that there was so much fuss about giving the votes to women is a surprise to many of us today. Having had a Prime Minister who is a woman, and having had 100 members of the House of Commons who are women, and today the House of Representatives now has 1/4 of its 435 members as women, that will be no surprise to us. We accept it. Many people would like to see a higher number. But the fear of allowing women the vote is the part of this subject that is not discussed enough. Some of them, they were just downright misogynists, downright woman haters, or thinking they weren't capable of coming to a decision over a vote. But there's another reason for this, which is not really mentioned very often, but I think it's applicable. If you look at politics, you might suggest that, let's forget the Labour Party, because at the time of the beginning of the 20th century, they were not really a power in the land. They were formed in 1900, but for this point of view, they're not really involved. But you would assume, if you were going to talk about changes reforming the system, that the Liberals would be the party to do it. After all, the Conservative, in general terms, would consider whether change is necessary before making that change, and would generally believe, or certainly at that time, in the status quo. Leave well alone. It works. The Liberals might take a different view. So you might think that if somebody wanted to make a huge change to our life by allowing women to vote, then it would be the Liberal Party to do it. Why didn't they? Why were they so against it? Why did they spend so much time opposing it? One, because of the violence which the suffragette campaign led to. That's one reason. And two, I think, and the more significant reason, is that they really did believe that the majority of women, if given the vote, would naturally vote Conservative. As for the Conservative Party, they opposed the vote because they just didn't think it was right that women should have the vote. They had women on a kind of respect pedestal, whatever you might call it. However, if they'd been sensible enough, they probably ought to have realised what the Liberals had already realised, that by granting the vote they would have provided themselves with a vast number of extra voters. However, they did not. Now, the whole of the 19th century is a demand by women for a measure of equality. Whether it means the Divorce Property Act, now that was an act of Parliament which basically said that once a woman was married, she had nothing. She had no property, no rights to children. It was only in 1857 that that law was achieved. Before then, a divorce had to have an individual act of Parliament. For instance, if you look at adultery, for a woman to commit adultery was enough of an offence for divorce. But for a man to be accused of adultery, he had to be accused of cruelty as well. So the whole of the law, and you must obviously you would know this, that women were not involved in the law in any way apart from being governed by it. So this attitude of inequality will show up in regards to marital rights, education. For instance, when the Primary Education Act came in 1870, it was the first time that education for girls up until the age of 11 was agreed to. But it was still 20 or 30 years before the universities would allow a degree. The provincial universities allowed a degree earlier. Oxford and Cambridge were bitterly, and I mean bitterly, opposed to making this alteration. Even when women took the exam and were top of their leagues, they still were not allowed to qualify.